Hello, my name is Madison Sissel. As an intern for the League of Women Voters of Lexington, I'm conducting this interview as part of my work for the League's Oral History Project. Today is Monday, April 25th, 2022, and it is my great honor and pleasure to interview Cindy Heine using Zoom here in Lexington, Kentucky. Thank
Good
you so much
morning.
for joining me today.
Good morning, Madison. I'm happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you interviewing you. So before we get into your background and family origins, I first wanted to check in with the pandemic since we're now over 2 years into it. So how are you doing and what has your life looked like these past 2 years?
Well, it's been extraordinarily busy. I'll say that. We have been isolated like most people because of our age. We are trying to be extra careful. And I still, even though most people have quit using masks, use masks almost all the time when I'm out. But we've fortunately been able to avoid getting sick and hope to continue in that vein.
Nice. And you said life has been busy. So what has been going on? And I'm guessing a lot of online meetings and
Yes,
Zoom.
definitely. League work has not stopped. We've continued our monthly meetings. I am a member of the Lexington League of Women Voters Board of Directors and the Kentucky League of Women Voters Board of Directors. And those groups meet monthly, sometimes more often. We have programs with the Lexington League that I've attended. We've been very active with the legislature, and you can watch everything online and communicate with members online. So it's just been a really, really busy time throughout, actually, but especially in the last few months. So not being able to get out has not meant that the work has stopped. The work has continued full force.
And so moving into your background and kind of family origins in your family, could you please just first state and spell your name for me?
Yes, Cynthia Jane Heine, Cynthia Janeheine. I usually go by Cindy.
And
Cindy.
and when and where were you born?
I was born in Sturgis, Michigan in 1946. Sturgis is a small community in the southern part of Michigan, halfway between Chicago and Detroit.
Great. And could you tell me about your parents?
My parents were Betty Reed and James Holly Lawrence Jr. My mother was born and raised in the Sturgis, Michigan area. She still lives there today. She's 98 years old, and she is in quite good health and very clear of mind. I just spoke with her last night, and she amazes me. She remembers everything, and she's still organizing and planning things in the assisted living facility where she lives. My father was born and raised in Fayette, Alabama. He was born on a farm. There were 12 siblings in that family. They raised cotton. They were poor farmers, basically, but probably not poor in that they owned land and were able to grow crops. I remember him telling us that his mother canned. She didn't freeze things, obviously, but they lived off the land and lived fairly well. My mother had a degree in nursing from the University of Michigan, and my father got a high school education. My father, as soon as he graduated from high school, left home to find better work. He didn't really want to work on the farm all of his life. He ended up in the Marines in World War II. He met my mother through the mail, via a cousin of hers who had a photo of her, and they corresponded by mail throughout the war. And after the war, they married, and he moved to Michigan to be where she was. He was in construction. He had his own construction business. That he did that all his life. He mostly did remodeling. He built the home that I grew up in. And then my mother was a nurse, and she worked until my brother was born when I was about 4. And then she was a homemaker and lifelong volunteer.
And they met, so her cousin sent your father a picture of her in the mail?
They were in the Marines together.
Okay.
And I don't think he sent it. I think they knew each other, and he
Okay.
just happened to see it, or he showed it to him, and he and mother corresponded. He did meet her before he shipped out. He was in the Pacific. He met her once at the University of Michigan in Cousins Hall, which was the dormitory where the nursing students resided. And she tells the story of she didn't come down right away, but all her friends marched through the lobby to check him out before she came down. And at that point, they continued to correspond. And then when he came home after the war, they decided to marry.
Wonderful. And do you have siblings?
I have one brother and 2 sisters, all younger than I am.
And what are their names and ages relative to you?
My brother is James Holly Lawrence III, nicknamed Lucky. He is in Omaha, Nebraska. He's 4 years younger than I am. My sister Claudia Lawrence Lay lives in near Kalamazoo, Michigan. And she is 8 years younger than I am. My youngest sister, Leanne Lampin, is 10 years younger, and she also lives in the Kalamazoo area.
And what are their occupations?
My brother was a photographer and worked in photography until photography no longer was a viable business because of digital photography. And then he served as a bus driver for a while. He's now retired. My second sister got a degree in international studies. She married a man from Vietnam, and they lived in Singapore for a number of years. He is now deceased, and she lives in Michigan, close to her children. And then my other sister has been a homemaker. She got a degree in occupational therapy, but never really worked in that area. She married, and she and her husband had 7 children, and she homeschooled all of them for almost all of their school careers. And she's now a professional grandmother.
And do you know your family origins as far as, when they arrived in the US and where they came from?
My father's side of the family, the Lawrence family, we just recently discovered that they landed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the probably early 1700s. And they were there for quite a long time and then moved around. We discovered my great-great-grandfather was actually born in Kentucky, but didn't stay here long. And he ended up in Alabama, Fayette, Alabama, northwest Alabama. I don't know exactly why they ended up in Alabama, but they did. My mother has German and English roots, and don't know a lot of detail about that. We just know that there's German and English heritage there.
Gotcha. And do you have children yourself?
We do. We have 2 children. Our son David is married to his wife Sula, Chris Sula, and they have one son, Aiden, who is 19, and our daughter Joy Excuse me. Our son, by the way, is an electrical engineer. He lives in Mountain View, California, and has worked in the tech industry since he graduated from college. He now works for Google. Our daughter is married to her son, Michael Wisnowski. They have two children, Sienna, who is 14, and August, who is 12. They live in Homewood, Illinois, which is on the south side of Chicago. She is actually a Lutheran pastor, and she has a small congregation in Gary, Indiana, in the community there of Miller Beach, which is right on Lake Michigan. She has a degree in early childhood and then 2 master's degrees in one is in theology, arts and theology, and the other was the degree that it took to become a minister. She worked in early childhood for a while. She worked in advocacy for workers, low-income workers, in an organization in Chicago, and the name of that group escapes me. But that's the children. Our son, excuse me, has an electrical engineering degree from Princeton University, and his PhD and master's degrees are from Stanford.
Oh. And where have you lived, and how long have you been in the Lexington area?
We were married when we were in school. I went to the University of Michigan and got a degree in nursing. I met my husband at the university. His degree is in mathematical psychology. We met and married in Ann Arbor. And when he finished his PhD, we moved to Frankfort, Kentucky, where he worked for the Department of Mental Health. We lived in Frankfort for 1 year, and then we bought a home in Lexington, where we still reside. That was 1971. So we've been here a long time.
And you're still in the same house?
Yes.
Wow. Do you feel like the different communities you've lived in have had an impact on your political beliefs?
Yes. Probably Ann Arbor was as influential as any. At growing up, I don't remember. I know my mother and father always voted. My father always read the paper from stem to stern, but he wasn't much of a reader other than that. But I don't remember any political conversations in our home growing up. When I went to Michigan, that was in the 60s. I graduated from there in 1969. And those were pretty tumultuous years on campuses. There were strikes, there were protests. That was, of course, during the war years, the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of turmoil over that. And so I suppose my life on campus had some influence in my belief that the democracy is very important and we need to protect it.
And I'm definitely going to come back in a bit to talk more about your parents and their political beliefs and activity, but you said that you remember them voting. Would they ever take you with them to vote?
I don't remember ever going with them to vote, no.
Okay. So do you feel like your involvement in the League was impacted at all by your parents and their beliefs?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about that, except that recently I had been thinking about the fact that there were no conversations in our home about that. My dad was a strong supporter of this country. He fought in World War II to protect our rights, and I know he thought that was important. Mother was very involved in the community and volunteer work, but I don't recall that she ever was engaged in politics in any way. So I don't know. I think, they were just a basic, strong, salt of the earth kind of folks, good folks, loving parents. They always did the right thing. Dad and mom both were engaged in Cub Scouts and PTA and all the things that you do for your children, but really not political. So I guess the fact that they believed in fairness and helping your fellow citizens and community members was a piece of what led me to do the kinds of things that I've done. But I can't say that it influenced me politically.
So is there a way in which your upbringing did contribute to your political activity?
I think it was just a basic sense of the need for fairness. I had a good education, I believe, in the small community where we live. Michigan has always, I think, done a good job of providing sufficient funds for a good education. I was a part of the baby boomers, and when I was a sophomore in high school, we moved into a brand new, beautiful high school that the community supported very well. I would guess that some of what I learned in my history and civics classes in high school had an influence. I don't know. That's just a really good question. I have to think about that a little more.
Yeah, that's all right. Do you have any other family members that are also League members?
I do not.
Okay. So I'm wanting to shift gears now and focus on your childhood, and I'll pry a little bit more about your parents if you don't mind. But could you just first tell me about your experience growing up in, I've already forgotten the name of the town in
Sturgis.
Michigan.
Sturgis.
Sturgis. And is that Sturgis?
Yes.
Okay. What was it like growing up in Sturgis?
Well, it was, I think, a typical small town American community. Basic good values. My uncle lived on a farm, and so the importance of farming. And I remember he had dairy cattle, and every single day, morning and night, they were milking those cows. And so every holiday, we get together, but 4 o'clock came and they had to head back home. So the values of hard work and persistence and commitment were probably instilled through that. I'm trying to think of, I know one thing that was true is because these were the baby boom years, we moved schools a lot. So I started, my father built the home that we grew up in, but before we moved into that home, we lived in a smaller community outside of Sturgis that had a one-room schoolhouse. So I started school in that one-room schoolhouse.
Oh.
My kindergarten, it grades kindergarten through 8. And my kindergarten class was probably the biggest of the classes. There were 4 of us. When we moved into town, when my father finished the home that we grew up in, we moved to one school. We were just outside the city limits, so we went to a county school. I was there for the rest of first grade and second and third grade. By 4th grade, I was moved to a brand new elementary school in town. And then after 1 year there, I got moved to another elementary school in town for 5th and 6th grade. And then the middle school, high school combination, I was there for 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. And then 10th grade, we moved into the new building. So in this community of about 10,000 people, I went to multiple schools, and it was just because they had to put us where they had space.
Mm-hmm.
The school that was closest to my home, where I could have walked, I never went to because there wasn't room in that building, I guess, for the kids on our street. So, and I remember my parents had never complained. I mean, if you move children around that much today, parents would be fussing.
Mm-hmm.
They never complained. They were just grateful that we were able to get a good education. My sisters and brothers all went to different schools than I went to. And again, it was just because I'm sure they had to put us where they had space.
And do you remember, your career aspirations as a child? Like, did you always want to go to nursing school?
No, my mother was a nurse and I decided I didn't want to be a nurse. The choices then for women generally were nursing and education.
Hmm.
And I remember playing with building blocks when I was a kid, thinking I wanted to be an architect because I thought creating buildings would be fun. But I guess reality set in as I got older. I wanted to see if I would like nursing. So I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for 2 years in high school, I think, just to be sure that I would like that kind of work. And I did. And so I pursued nursing at the University of Michigan.
And so you said you remembered your parents voting. Would they ever talk with you about political campaigns for candidates?
Not a word. I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
That just was not, we just were not a political home.
Yeah.
At least not in conversation, but dedicated to voting.
Right. And it sounds like community engagement too. Would they ever share stories about, World War I or II or, the Depression or other big events like that?
Not a lot. Dad was very quiet about his years in the service. He did, however, my brother worked with him in construction when he was growing up. And my brother has stories that he told while they were working, but he never talked to us about that. Mother was in school, of course, during the war years. She graduated from high school in 1941. By the way, she and the one remaining classmate of hers celebrated their 80th high school reunion last summer.
Wow.
We took them to lunch. Actually, it was not, it was last summer, 2021. She talked a little bit. I did a little interviewing with her. I have at times over the years, just wanting to get some family history. And,
Right.
she remembers growing up in this small community with some really good buddies. She ended up being the class president of her high school class. And as a result, planned all the reunions over the years. She's an organizer. She kept notebooks. She sent me clippings of my classmates, and I've kept notebooks of my classmates. She was a seamstress. She sewed most of our clothes growing up. She canned food. I mean, they were very, very careful about their resources. Spent them wisely. Dad never had a credit card until he had to travel and couldn't rent a car without one. He bought cars with cash. He built our home in about a year and a half, paid for the supplies as he went. And when he was done, he owed a small amount of money that was paid off within another year and a half or 2 years. So my dad taught us good economic advice. Save money, don't spend if you don't need to, don't get into debt if you don't need to.
And so now that we've talked a little bit about what it was like to grow up, I'd like to shift and learn more about your adult life. You said you attended college at Michigan State University.
No, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Sorry.
Yeah, all right.
And it was for nursing. That was your major and degree.
Yes, I had a bachelor's degree in nursing.
And could you remind me what years you were there?
I was there from 1965 when I graduated from high school to 1969.
Okay. And you spoke a little bit about student life, but I'd like to hear more and if you were involved in any extracurriculars too.
I was. There was a student activities board that I got involved with at the student union. I took charge of some social programming. I remember we engaged Miriam Makeba, who was an African-American vocalist, and we had her come and sing at one point. So I was engaged in that. School was pretty, there was a lot of, I mean, it was hard work. And so, I didn't do lots of extra things, but I did get engaged some. I did not get engaged with the war activities. I watched my friends go off to some of the protests, but I didn't have time for that.
And were you politically involved while in college?
Not really.
Do you feel like that community had an impact on your political identity?
I think it did. I resonated with students. I mean, I was not in favor of the war. I didn't take action on it, but I fully supported the anti-war efforts in spirit.
And do you remember the first time you went to vote?
I don't. In those years, you had to be 21, so I was obviously on campus. And I'm sure I voted in the first election when I was able to, but I don't remember it.
That's
Isn't
right.
that funny?
I feel like I don't remember the first time I voted either, and that was only 5 years
No,
ago.
I think voting was just one of those things that you did when you grew up and you were an adult, and it wasn't like a big deal. It was like, okay, so I'm 21 now, it's time for me to vote.
Mhm.
So
So now switching to your career, what would you consider your first job to be?
when I graduated from the University of Michigan, I went to work at the university hospital. And I worked there until we moved to Kentucky. I worked on a private floor, and that meant that we had all kinds of patients. It wasn't just surgery or medical or GYN or anything like that. It was everything. So it was a really broadening experience, a little frightening now as I think back on it. We had burn patients, we had kidney transplant patients, we had heart patients, we had GYNs, we had exec exams. The guys who came in from Detroit who were executives who just came in for a 24, 48-hour series of testing just to be sure they were healthy. So it was a really broad experience. Then when we moved to Kentucky, I worked for a while, and this was all pretty part-time. I worked for a while at the Frankfurt Hospital, Kentucky Hospital, King's Daughters. And I worked there in the intensive care, cardiac care unit. Did some training in Louisville, a couple of weeks of training, and then worked there for a while. And then when we moved to Lexington, I stopped working until the children were a little older. And I ended up working I got involved actually when our daughter was born with Lamaze training, childbirth education training. There was an organization that was just being created that was trying to humanize childbirth, make it more family centered. And I got involved with that and began as a volunteer teaching patients in the University of Kentucky OB clinic, Lamaze, and health education for pregnancy. Ended up doing Lamaze classes officially for them and ended up working in the clinic for a couple of years. And as I worked in the clinic, I ended up working in the young parents program, which was the teenage pregnancy program. And we worked with the young mothers, providing education, providing support for them before and after their children were born. after had been there for quite a while, or while I was there, I had a very good friend, Pam Papka Sexton, who was involved with the Pritchard Committee. You probably haven't heard of the Pritchard Committee. They were created in 1980 as an organization looking at improving higher education in Kentucky's future. Their member and chairman, Ed Pritchard, the committee was named after when it officially became a nonprofit 501c3 in 1983. And at that point, after having conducted a study about higher education and making recommendations, they turned to elementary and secondary education. And at that point, I became a volunteer member because of my friendship with Pam Sexton. One of the things that was really significant about that is that they took the league principles into practice as they created the policies around which they would advocate. So one of the things the league does is we study issues. And when I say we study issues, we ask a question that we want to know the answer to, and then we focus on that with literature, studies, information about both sides of those issues. Then we have a conversation among the members and come to agreement on what policy positions we might take. So that notion that the Pritchard Committee used was used by the Pritchard Committee. One of the reasons that's the case is because the then national president of the League of Women Voters was Dorothy Ridings, who was a Kentucky League member who lived in Louisville. And she became a member of the Pritchard Committee, its original organization. And then she was the chair after Ed Pritchard passed away. Ed Pritchard chaired that group until he died in 1984. So the league was very engaged there. And many of the women on the Pritchard Committee, and by the way, this was probably one of the first big study groups, policy groups, focused on education anyway, and probably other things, that was probably almost half women. Mm-hmm. So Pam was a member, Dot Ridings was a member. There were members from Louisville, from Northern Kentucky, and they all were, they understood the process of study and coming to consensus around policy issues. So just like the league has done, and we have policies at the state level, the national level, and the local level, the Pritchard Committee created their first report, In Pursuit of Excellence, using that process. And that was the kind of the guidebook for policies for the Pritchard Committee over the years. And when I joined in 1983, and we took on elementary and secondary education, we were divided into 7 subgroups, one on teaching and learning, one on children and youth, one on teacher education, one on vocational education, one on finance, et cetera. And each of those subgroups then took on a study of that issue. And the group that I was in, the children and youth issue, addressed things like early childhood, the need for good quality prenatal care, good nutrition for children, quality childcare and early childhood programs to help children build the skills that they needed to do well in school. So that was very intertwined. I worked for the university until 1989, when the executive director of the Pritchard Committee, Bob Sexton, who was Pam's second husband, invited me to join him on the staff. And Bob and one secretary, bookkeeper, receptionist, jack of all trades, and I were the staff members beginning in 1989. He had been staffing the committee since it began, he staffed the work of the first report. And then in 1983, when they regrouped and became a nonprofit, they hired Bob as their executive director. So he worked for the Pritchard Committee from from the very beginning, but officially from 1983 until his death in 2010.
And does that kind of encapsulate your career up to this point in time?
Yes.
Where are you from 1989 onwards?
I worked for the committee until I retired in 2014.
Okay.
In 2010, Bob was diagnosed with cancer. And from that diagnosis on, I stepped in his place. And officially, when he died in he was diagnosed in 2008, I believe, maybe 2009. He died, he was diagnosed in 2009. When he died in 2010, I stepped in as the acting executive director for a year until we hired his replacement, Stu Silberman, in 2011. And then I worked with Stu for 3 years until I retired in 2014. And then I became a full-time volunteer.
I was going to ask, so what has life looked like since 2014 and in retirement, maybe not so retirement?
It's been busy. I would not be happy just sitting around doing nothing. I've done a lot of work with our church, and in particular with our early learning program. One of the things that I did in my last years with the Pritchard Committee was a strong effort promoting quality preschool education for all children. And it was interesting and fun to go from that statewide advocacy for quality programs and funding to the nitty-gritty of running a small preschool or early childhood program. I'm still on that committee at church that runs that program, and I just stepped down as chair this spring. With the league, I continued as a member of the state board and the local board in Lexington. I was chair in the Lexington area for several years, and then joined the state board, and I was co-chair there for about 4 or 5 years. I'd have to go back and look at those years at the state level, and then I've stayed on the board since. And currently I serve as a co-legislative liaison with Mary Jo Rogers, who lives in Louisville. And our major responsibility is following the legislature.
And I'm definitely going to ask you about that soon. But before we move into solely your league involvement, I'm wondering what accomplishments were you most proud of in your career?
Interesting. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. When I was at the university, I worked hard to create a preschool Lamaze class for the women in the clinic at the university. The clinic included primarily young and often unmarried teenagers and other folks who were either high risk or couldn't afford to have a private physician. And I felt like they needed the opportunity for childbirth preparation and good preschool prenatal education as women who could afford it. And so for a number of years, I taught Lamaze classes there. And I felt that was really important. I think working for the Pritchard Committee was, it was a real broadening experience for me. It's the first time I had ever gone to Frankfurt, was when I worked for the committee. One of the things I was asked to do, the very first thing when I joined the committee on the staff, is Bob asked me to complete and publish a book the school answer book, we called it, that was just a Q&A about things that the public and parents needed to know to be engaged in their schools. One of the things the Pritchard Committee is deeply committed to is parent and citizen engagement, just like the league. And so we simply answered questions like, are school board meetings open to the public? Yes, they were, but people didn't know that. And in many communities in this state, the school board members met in small rooms that didn't have room for the public to even, move into. We also established an 800 line, and I answered that for a long time. Let me back up to say, when I joined the committee in 1989, the Supreme Court had not yet ruled in the the Rose versus Board of Education case. And so I started working in March, and in June, the Kentucky Supreme Court ruled that our entire school system was totally thrown out. I mean, they just said it was not functioning the way the Constitution intended. And so every law was taken off the books and had to be rethought and rewritten or discarded and replaced. So the first thing that I was asked to do was create that school answer book, but second, to go to Frankfurt to find out what the result was going to be of this ruling. Fortunately, the legislature took it seriously. They created 3 subcommittees that looked at curriculum and instruction, looked at finances, and looked at governance. And so my job was simply to go to Frankfurt and sit and listen and report back to Bob and tell him what kinds of things were going on and share all the material that we picked up. So I had a front row seat on the Kentucky Education Reform Act formation. That law was passed in 1990 and went into effect, some of the things immediately and some over a period of time. The school answer book was revised to reflect the things that happened in the Reform Act, and I crafted that. And then there were lots of other things that were going on that were very different from what people had been experiencing. So with the help of a colleague, we published a book on the primary school, which was a new way of looking at elementary school. We published a book on the school-based decision-making, which was a totally different way of governance for Kentucky schools, and another one on finance. So I helped do that. And then each year for a number of years, I wrote a book called Kentucky School Updates. And we just listed all the various programs that had been put in place because of the Education Reform Act and what was happening over time. So the numbers of children, there was a section on preschool, the numbers of children in preschool. There was a section on school-based decision-making, any changes in the law, the kinds of things that parents needed to know, where they could get more information. So I guess one of the things I can express some pride in is providing information to the public and to parents about how they could be engaged, what they needed to know. And I tried to do it in language that was understandable, that wasn't, legalese.
And thank you for sharing all of that.
That's a lot, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's all really rich. I guess backtracking a little bit, because it sounds like, is this right in saying you kind of started having children or raised them primarily in Lexington?
Yes.
So, and I'll ask you later about, the exact story of your involvement with the league, but what year did you become a member?
I think I became a member in 1977. I don't remember that, but I recently was looking through member lists. And I think it was a 76, 77, or 77, 78 member list for Lexington where my name first showed up.
Okay.
I
And
became
so-
a member, I would say, because of my friend Pam
Mhm.
and other members, other friends who were members, but mostly because of Pam. She was a
And-
very deeply involved member in the league.
And so my understanding based off of what you said is you met her and were you working with her with the Pritchard committee and that's kind of how you were introduced to, oh, sorry.
She introduced me to the Pritchard committee, yes, but we met the very first year that we lived in Lexington. I went to a newcomers meeting and she was there. And we went around the room and introduced ourselves. And I said I was from Michigan and so on. And she introduced herself as having been born and raised in Wyoming. Well, it turns out my husband did his middle and high school years and his college years in Wyoming.
Wow.
And they knew each other.
Wow.
And so we both were pregnant with our second daughters, our second children, and neither of us had family in Lexington, so we kind of became family. We took care of each other's kids. Our girls were born within 6 weeks of each other, and they've been good friends, lifelong friends. So it's just, that's just how it happened. And then she was engaged. She ended up divorcing and marrying her first husband and married Bob Sexton, and she was engaged politically. And ended up being appointed to that first Pritchard Committee study group in 1980. And once that group finished their work, the group of members decided that they didn't want to just let their report sit on the shelf and get dusty. They really wanted to see some action. And so they regrouped, became the nonprofit, and hired Bob as their executive director. And at that point, they were looking for parents, kind of activist parents and citizens to join the study of elementary and secondary education. And just as I guess one of the reasons they invited me to join was because we had a serious problem with a principal in our elementary school in Lexington. He had been verbally and physically abusive to students. He'd been verbally abusive to staff. And a group of parents decided that was not going to be appropriate. And so we got together and hired an attorney and got him removed from the school system. And at one point, when I was in the middle of all of that, Pam took me to visit Ed Pritchard. He was in the hospital getting kidney dialysis. He was in kidney failure for the last years of his life. She said, Cindy, I want you to go and talk with him and get his advice on what to do. And so I did that. And he suggested an attorney for us to call. And we did that. And we were able to get the principal removed from the school system. So it was that bit of activism, I think, that caused Pam and Bob to think I would make a good member of the committee.
Gotcha. And how did she introduce you to the league?
She was just a member and she talked about it and talked about her work and the work that they were doing. And because of that, I joined.
So how are you able to balance your league membership while raising a family? And then
I didn't really become active in the league until our daughter was a senior in high school. She's our youngest. And at that point, I felt like I would have the time to be engaged. During the school years, there was soccer, there was baseball, there were music lessons, there were, all kinds of things that I was engaged in as a volunteer. I was doing a lot of work with the childbirth education group for a number of years, PTAs. And so I didn't get engaged with the league as a volunteer until about 1989 or 90.
So I guess would the more appropriate question be, how did you balance working with your league membership?
Well, I wasn't as involved then while I was working as I became involved after I retired.
Okay.
The first job I took on for the Lexington League was the secretary of the Lexington League of Women Voters. And it occurred to me that as secretary, I would have to get to know the names because I'd have to write them down and spell them correctly. And I'd have to understand the issues if I was going to write about them in the minutes. And so for a number of years, I served as secretary, and that was a real good beginning and a good grounding before I got involved otherwise.
And was this in the early 90s that you were secretary?
This would have been in the 90s, yes.
Okay. And do you remember how many years you did that for?
No, I'd have to go back and look to see when things shifted. I ended up being the president in Lexington for a number of years, but I can't remember what years those were.
All right.
But I did that for 3 or 4 years. And then I can't actually remember. I'd have to go back to remember exactly when I started working on the state board and what I did initially. Sorry, that's not coming. That's not coming up real quickly. But I got quite involved at the state level. And then at one point, we were desperate for a state chair, and 2 of us agreed to co-chair. So we co-chaired for a couple of years at the state level. And then I was secretary at the state level for a while, I think. I'd have to go back and revisit all of that. It's all kind of a blur.
Right.
When I left the Pritchard Committee and retired, of course, I had more time. And at that point, we had liaisons to the legislature. That was Terry Naden and Nita Smith. And as I left, by the way, when I worked for the Pritchard Committee, I had to register as a lobbyist. So I spent a lot of time in Frankfurt in those years working for the committee.
Okay.
Bob was kind of a master at public relations and getting the community engaged. And I learned a lot working with him. That was just real valuable experience. Let me just say one other thing about that, because I think it's important, and I forgot about that. When you ask, what could I be proud of? In 1984, this was my second year as a member of the committee. The Pritchard Committee decided to host a town forums across the state to get a sense of what the public thought about our public schools. And I was asked to chair the Fayette County event. We held events in every county in the state, or every county was represented. In November of 1984, about 20,000 people showed up in their own communities connected by KET for an introduction. And then we as local organizers were trained in how to do a public meeting and get public input. And so we simply asked the question, what do you want from your schools? And we listened and we collected all that information, and that helped play into the elementary and secondary education report that we issued in 1985. And so I guess I could express some pride in conducting that meeting. Because we went to Transylvania University, filled their auditorium with at least 800, maybe 900 people. Wow. And conducted a public forum in Lexington. Yeah. And I organized that.
And I just want to ask you a few questions about like political events throughout your adulthood before we really get into all the league things. So what were some major political events that left an impression on you throughout either your childhood, young adulthood, or adulthood?
Well, the Vietnam War was one, and the fact that people could protest and change the minds of policymakers. That I think was an important lesson. In terms of political activity in Kentucky, I wasn't really engaged. I never got engaged with the party, either party. In terms of active work, I did support some candidates, but not in a lot of depth. I've always thought that a balance is important. I saw, as I watched when I was working for the Pritchard Committee, and the House, the Senate, and the governor's office were all led by Democrats. I watched some of the shenanigans that went on, and I felt like when the Senate turned Republican, there was more balance, because there was, there were two Democratic parties. One was a little more conservative leaning and one was a little more progressive leaning, and they balanced each other out in ways, but not officially. So when you've got one party in charge in one house and one party in charge of the other, you have to have conversation. You have to have either that or you get gridlock, and maybe gridlock isn't bad if you don't pass bad bills. So I think those were important lessons for me. The other real important lesson for me, and this isn't as much political as it is just the reality of public policy, and that is you can put in place laws with the best of intentions, but the way they get implemented is not necessarily what anybody had in mind when they passed the bills. People figure out ways around the laws to do what they want to do instead of what the law intended them to do. So that's just an important lesson, because, we have this beautiful, comprehensive Education Reform Act. And if it had been implemented the way we thought it was going to be or should have been, we should have the best education system in the country today. It's not true. It's not true. So that's an important political lesson for me.
Any other that you'd like to share?
Not that I can think of at the moment, but I bet there will be some. I guess there also will always be shenanigans, and the Democrats did it. The Republicans have done it in spades this last year. They've got these super majorities and they can do pretty much anything they want, and yet they still find it necessary to pass bills without any public scrutiny. It's the nature of the beast.
What political events stick out to you currently?
I think I would say it's not an event as much as kind of a result. But after the 2016 election, a lot of people sort of woke up. I remember one friend in particular who joined the league saying, I thought everything was fine. Things were going along smoothly. Nothing really bad was happening politically. Thought we had good leadership. And then 2016 happened and things kind of fell apart. But what that did was it raised the awareness of a lot of people about the fact that democracy is not a spectator sport. If you want to protect the democracy, you have to work for it. And we've seen that with all of the events surrounding the 2016 election, the number of women's events that came about. I've gone to several of them, down at the courthouse. And then after the George Floyd killing and the Breonna Taylor situation, the fact that the public can make a change by standing up and speaking out, and that's not easy. It's not hard, and it doesn't happen quickly. It just takes persistence and a lot of hard work. and a lot of strategy to try to make a difference and be sure we're protecting our democracy.
Mhm. And I'm wondering if you could also talk, about how is it correct to say that, this legislative session just ended? And so could you tell me about what you were working on as a legislative liaison and
Yes,
how that went?
we worked on, we had going into it 2 very specific bills. One had to do with redistricting. We have been working on redistricting since, since the last redistricting, actually. The league started talking about it shortly after 2012, 2013, when the legislature put boundaries in place that were challenged in court. And then it took another year before boundaries were set that were in place until just recently. But it became obvious to us that there were areas that were gerrymandered for the benefit of a particular party. And that had been going on for years. But it became more obvious, I think, because of all the acrimony between the parties that has grown over the last 10 years. So we published a report in 2017, late 2017, and have been talking about it to groups around the state since then. And our basic premise was we wanted a better process than just the legislature doing their gerrymandering work. We wanted it to be open and transparent and public with public input. And we preached that, we asked for it, and of course it didn't happen. They did their own thing. They let us see their maps the Thursday before the Tuesday when the session opened in January. That was the House. The Senate didn't release their maps until the day they filed the bill on Tuesday. And by Saturday, with no public input, no public hearings, the bills were passed and on the governor's desk by Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon. So that was one big issue, and we're going to continue that. We put together a plan to talk to people around the state, and for the last 3 years now, we've talked to over 125 groups, and we did most of this on Zoom because it was during COVID. We talked to a lot of groups across the state, and to probably close to 3,000 people, as well as doing a lot of radio and TV interviews. So that was one big issue. The second issue that we've been working on since 2006, talk about the need for persistence, is restoring voting rights to people who were formerly incarcerated because of felony convictions. The Kentucky Constitution was changed back in the late 1800s to prohibit anybody with a felony conviction from their civil rights. So they could not vote. And many, many times over the years, as we've registered voters, somebody will walk by and will say, "Are you registered to vote? Do you want to register?" And they say, "No, I can't." And it turns out they had a felony conviction and they were not allowed to vote. Mm-hmm. So we've been working on that since 2006. And in the 2000 session, just before COVID, we almost had an agreement among a number of groups focused on that issue and legislators for a bill that we all could support. And COVID hit and everybody went home and that bill died. So we're still working to get that bill filed and heard, and nothing happened with it this session. We were promised a hearing in the interim last year. That didn't happen. We promised a hearing in this upcoming interim, and we're going to work hard to hold that legislator's feet to the fire and be sure we get a hearing. The public supports second chances for folks who've struggled and been incarcerated, and it's just heartbreaking to talk to somebody who is in their 60s who made a mistake when they were a teenager and they haven't been able to vote all these years.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because it reminds me of when I was talking to James Grant, because he's involved with the state committee for civil rights restoration. So are you kind of wearing your state hat when you're
Yes,
working with the felony rights and then also the gerrymandering, or is that a local?
that's all one.
Okay.
That's all one. Yeah. The redistricting is the gerrymander and restoring civil rights issue.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a state committee. Because it's a statewide issue, the state league deals with that.
Okay.
If there were a local ordinance or a local something coming up, we deal with that locally, but statewide issues, we deal with this at the state level with the
Okay.
state board.
And are you able to point to any political event that later predicted your involvement with the league or event in general?
I guess probably with the depth with which I'm working now, it was my work with the Pritchard Committee, because I learned and developed a number of skills in that work that have translated to the league work. The lobbying is one of them. You know, I had to register as a lobbyist for all those years. And so I knew Frankfurt, I know the Capitol building inside and out, know a lot of the players, and switching from advocating for education to advocating on behalf of the league was kind of a natural.
So now switching into the league, would you like to share more details about how you first became involved with the league in Lexington, and maybe also once you became involved with the state?
I think in terms of Lexington, after our daughter got to be a senior and I knew I would have more time, I agreed to serve on the local board as secretary. And I've already kind of talked about that. And then that just grew into other activities, voter registration, candidate forums. I worked a lot, and I've just now passed the responsibility for that on to somebody else. But I got very involved with the candidate forums here in Lexington. We started by, I remember the first one we did was a forum for the state senate in our district, which was District 12. And we did a candidate forum at the middle school in the cafeteria for the candidates and just asked them questions and invited the public. And that grew into a pretty extensive effort around candidate forums, where we hosted them at the downtown library. The library was willing to videotape them and then air them on their library channel. And then also, as technology advanced, post them on YouTube for people to watch after. So we would schedule 2 or 3 weekends in the spring and in the fall, schedule forums and invite the candidates to come. We ended up getting quite a bit of attention from local media and ended up working with WKYT to do some live and sometimes taped and aired later forums for mayor, for Congress. We never did one for Senate because we couldn't get the incumbents to participate. We also did that I worked on that on behalf of the state, and we did forums for governor and a couple of forums, I think, for congressional candidates. And we still do that. Now that's all changed because of COVID. So we don't do them in person anymore. We do them on Zoom and tape them and then put them up on our website for the public to see. We also, in fact, we just finished taping the last 2 this week, and I'm still doing some moderating. Liza Holland is organizing them, but I've moderated a couple of them this session. Always found it very informative to see and hear candidates in person respond to questions, and it doesn't take more than 30 minutes to figure out what you need to know about who you're going to vote for.
Yeah.
So that's been a huge piece of the work that I've done a lot of voter registration out in the public. One thing that I did recently, and this was because of a collaboration with other groups interested in restoring civil rights, the governor pardoned people with nonviolent felonies when he first came into office in 2019. And one of the organizations set up a through text program where you could, via text messaging, communicate with people who wanted to know if their voting rights were restored, and then help them figure that out, know where to go to find out if yes, for sure they were pardoned, and then help them register and vote. That was a fascinating experience. I hope to get back to doing more of that this fall. So did that answer your question?
Yes. I was wondering, it sounded like, so you will moderate the candidate forums?
I've moderated 3 of them this spring.
Okay. And then what kind of, what work are you doing to, make that come to fruition?
Well, Liza has them taped. They're being edited. Some of them are up now online. You can watch them if you're going to vote in Lexington and want to know about candidates. So yeah, they'll be available. We'll do a big press release as soon as they're all up and list all of the candidates that we invited, those that participated, those that declined, those that never responded to our invitation, and then give the links so that people know where to go to listen to them. The other thing that we started several years ago was Vote 411. And this is a National League program that allows you to ask candidates questions and create an online voter guide. We did that specifically trying to interest younger voters in learning about candidates, because we figured they wouldn't spend 30 minutes watching a forum, but they might on their phones go look at questions and answers from the candidates. And we're doing that now in Lexington, and there's a statewide effort. We found somebody who's been willing to work on that at the statewide level. So that's another way that we work to inform the public about the candidates so that they can make good decisions. One of the reasons the league was formed back in 1920 was because here were these millions of new voters, women who'd never voted before. And the women who had advocated for the suffrage movement wanted to be sure those women had good information and were informed voters. And so they determined at that point to be nonpartisan and to help women learn about the candidates. And so that's where that came from. And it's still one of our most important jobs now is register voters, help inform them, and try to be sure they get to the polls to vote.
I'm wondering if you could describe what a typical league meeting at the local level looked like throughout the years of your involvement, because my understanding is it's shifted a bit where now it's all online. But when you first became involved, were you all still meeting in
Oh, yes.
homes? And
we were meeting in homes. When I first started, we were meeting in homes. And then we ended up doing a lot of our meetings in the last years that before COVID, at a building connected to our church, where there was a nice big boardroom type table. So we'd meet wherever we could find a space. Often we had refreshments. And, we just sat around a table and had an agenda and walked through the agenda, and everybody did their reports. And then we went from there. We took information from the board meetings that went into the local newsletter, the Lexington Voter, to help inform the rest of the members. In Lexington, we have almost always, not as good all years, but we've had community forums, and that's another part of our mission, to inform the public about important public policy issues. So, for example, last week, the Lexington League hosted a forum with Don Blevins to update people on the changes in voting here in Lexington, Fayette County. So we've had forums around important issues for years. The one thing that I haven't talked about is our studies. Have you talked to anybody about our studies and how they work? I mentioned it just briefly.
Yeah, so a few people have told me about the issues surrounding them, but I guess I'd be interested to hear more about how they actually work and yeah, what issues are the ones that you
the local members or members of local leagues can go to the state with an issue that they think is important and say, what should our policy be around this issue? So the most recent real intense study was around the water company. And we posed questions about the water company ownership and what we thought that should look like. And we put together information pro public ownership, pro private ownership, and put it together in booklets so that people could get a sense of both sides of the issue. We put those together in 3-ring binders and put them in about 5 local libraries so our members could access that information. That was the process before all this online opportunity came up. Now we would put it all online and let people read it online. And then we'd hold committee meetings on the water company. We had several meetings. We invited people from the water company, from the public side of it, from the private side of it, to talk and answer questions. And then we'd have a meeting and come to consensus around what we thought, based on what we had learned, we wanted the Lexington policy to be. So that's kind of how they work. They're a lot of work. We haven't done that work a lot lately because they are a lot of work. I'd like us to get back to doing that because that was one of the things I enjoyed most about the league, was having the opportunity to look at both sides of these important issues and then have conversations around it, hear from people on both sides, and then, decide what I thought about it. That was the process. I think I mentioned, but I'm going to reiterate, that was a process that the Pritchard Committee used when they came up with their policy positions around elementary, secondary, and higher education. And so that was that's a really good league process that's has held us in good stead all these years.
And could you tell me more about issues that the league was working on throughout your involvement?
Well, we worked on the water issue in Lexington. Mm-hmm. At the state level, we've really focused a lot on restoring civil rights for a number of years, and of course, the redistricting. Since I have become a co-legislative liaison, those are the 2 issues that have been key for us. We have been concerned about other issues that have come up around education. For example, we are not in favor of providing tax money in the form of tax credits for private schools, because that takes millions of dollars away from the general fund that could go to public education. So we're very interested in public education, not private education. We were concerned this time around the notion of changing our tax code to reduce and eventually eliminate the individual income tax and replace it with something else. Primarily, it would have to be sales taxes or other taxes. And so we advocated against the bill that made those changes this session. If you reduce the state income tax by 1%, you lose almost $1 billion a year. And our income tax rate right now is 6%. And the plan for replacing that $1 billion didn't come close to replacing it. They added sales tax to some services. And we just don't think that's a very good way to provide the ongoing resources needed to sustain state government in an appropriate way. So that was one of the issues we got involved in.
Yeah. Have you ever been involved with the naturalization ceremonies?
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's a fun thing.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
We've been doing that for a long time. I didn't get involved in that until maybe 10 years ago. And my involvement was mostly to just go down to the courthouse and be there during the ceremonies and then be available afterwards to register voters. Mm-hmm. It's heartwarming. It is heartwarming to see people who have worked for 5 years or more, mostly more, from all over the world who are becoming naturalized citizens. And they're so proud. Their families come, they bring flowers for them, they take pictures. They're just so proud to become citizens. And it's just a heartwarming experience.
Yeah. And I feel like you've given a bit of a breakdown of your involvement with the league up until now, but is there anything missing so far?
I guess a little bit around publicity.
Okay.
I've done quite a bit of work around that. And again, that's kind of a behind the scenes activity. But we work pretty hard to help the public know that we exist. A lot of people don't know what the League of Women Voters is. And so we both at the Lexington and the state levels, I've issued press releases and tried to keep the public aware of what, and the press aware of what we're doing. That's a pretty big job because media lists change all the time. Reporters don't stay long in any one spot. They move on or they quit or whatever. So I've done quite a bit of work around that. And I learned that through my work with the Pritchard Committee. So that's a big piece. I have not done much with social media. That's just not something I've been comfortable with or knowledgeable enough to do, but we are working on that. We do have websites for both organizations, and we do have social media platforms, some more active than others. Same with Facebook. Those are just not things that I've been very engaged in. Trying to think if there's anything else. I guess the other thing that I've tried to do, and this is hard and sometimes it pays off and not, but developing the league in terms of developing new leaders and younger leaders has been important. So for the last couple of years, we have tried to do board orientations for new members, because new people come on and they don't understand the philosophy of the league. We speak with one voice, so generally there's one spokesperson for the state league and for the local leagues, unless there's somebody who's very experienced and knowledgeable and can speak kind of with the approval of the presidents. The fact that we're nonpartisan, it's really hard if you've got real strong feelings about candidates to maintain sometimes a nonpartisan position. As a visible member of the league, we ask board members to be very careful about things like candidate fundraising events, not sponsoring them. We encourage people to participate, to vote, to contribute if they want to, but not publicly if they're visible. And of course, we ask people not to speak on behalf of the league if in fact they are speaking at all politically. Mm-hmm. We had a bad situation one time when a woman who was interested in the league came to a few meetings but never joined, went to a high school, registered voters, and then didn't conveniently happen to turn in the cards for those who registered for the party that she wasn't a part of.
Ugh.
And when that came to light and she said she was registering on behalf of the league, that was a problem.
Yeah.
Because we don't do that. We do not do that. We'll register anybody. Doesn't matter what party. We'll encourage them to vote. It doesn't matter what party. So it's important as people join the league and get engaged that they understand that. And some people really like that because they're sick and tired of the acrimony among the parties. Other people find that to be hard, and then they have to either back off, or some have actually decided I can't be a member of the league because I want to be engaged in party activities.
And have you told me of all the formal positions you've had in the league?
Probably not, and I'm not sure I can remember them all.
Okay.
Often what I've done is, especially at the local level, what I've often done is I've stepped in when there was a void.
Okay.
So I stepped in for the candidate forums, and I did that for years. I got that down pat. It was a lot of work. It was good work. And now I found somebody who's taken that on and is doing a fabulous job. I stepped in with a publicity, because if you don't have a publicity chair, you got to get press releases out if you're going to get people to your meetings. So I've stepped in to do that. I'd have to go back and look at board lists to see what I was listed as doing over those years. We did create, we created an essay contest several years ago, and other people are doing that now, but I got that started at the suggestion of one of our older members, who'd said to me one time, don't you think wouldn't it be a good idea to have an essay contest and have high school students writing about, democratic issues or issues around democracy? And so we did, and we continue that today. So I've just kind of stepped up to do what needed to be done when it needed to be done.
Does that go as far as committees as well? What committees have you been involved in?
Recently, at the state level, the redistricting committee and the restoring civil rights committee. I'm also a member of the education committee at the state level. And then at the local level, I'm really starting to back off there. I've just decided I need to not be as deeply engaged, and other people need to step up. So I'm actually not going to be on the board of the Lexington League this coming year for the first time in a long, long time. At the local level, I was chair of the nominating committee and chair of the bylaws committee. Boring bylaws is boring stuff, but it has to be done.
Oh, I like bylaws.
Oh, do you? Okay, well, hang around. We'll put you to work. Although we just updated them, and unfortunately they're in good shape. We don't need much work on those right now. I was deeply engaged, as I said, with the and led the candidate forum effort. I led the vote for one effort just for a brief while until we turned that over to somebody else. I guess those are the big ones at the local level recently.
And I'm wondering who has had an impact on you during your time in the league, that you've already mentioned or haven't mentioned, and who have you worked with during your time?
Well, I have to say there are several members that I got to know at the state and local level that were influential. At the state level, Carolyn Self, who is a longtime member in Hopkinsville and a very, very dear, smart woman. Reva Hart, who was a leader in Elizabethtown, very dedicated, strong member of the league. Reva moved, I'm not sure where, she moved to be close to family as she got older. And unfortunately, that league folded because she was holding it together. In Lexington, one of my one of my favorite people is Ruth Strauss, who I think you've interviewed.
She was one of the first people.
She's kind of the epitome to me of a league member. Smart, ask good questions, skeptical of things, wants to know, how things are going and why. She's still like that. I just really have admired her. And then Dot Writings. Dot was the woman, I didn't meet her until I got involved with the Pritchard Committee, but she was the national president of the League of Women Voters for several years in the 80s. And she's a journalist, really fun, smart, down-to-earth lady. She's a member in Louisville. She left Kentucky for work and came back after she'd retired, and is an active member in Louisville now. So those are some of the people that I've looked up to and thought highly of over the years.
And are there members that you feel like you've mentored? I'm mainly wondering this just because I feel like everyone I've interviewed, when I've asked them that question, they said, "Oh, you need to talk to Cindy Heine," or "Cindy Heine had such a big impact on me."
Yeah, I think there are quite a few people. I try to mentor and encourage and find places where people can contribute, where they want to contribute, where their passions are. And one of the things you're supposed to do as a league member when you are a chairperson or have an office on the league is keep your portfolio. We don't use that term much anymore. And then pass that on with the information they need to take up the job and do the next level of work. The other thing that I've been doing that is, one of those things that has to be done is membership. I've often said, if I could just take one of those jobs and do that all by itself, I could do a bang up job. But as it was, sometimes I did a half-baked job of a lot of things because they needed to be done. But membership is important. Recruiting members, helping get them engaged in an area where they're interested, keeping the administrative list together, being sure that the names of new members get onto our databases so that they get our newsletters and all of our emails. So that's another thing I've done over the years, kind of unofficially in some cases, is I served as membership chair both for Lexington and for the state. And now fortunately we have two people. Maureen Murphy is doing this at the Lexington level. I don't know if you've talked to Maureen Murphy yet. Well, you should talk to Maureen at some point. She's a new member, but she's taken on membership with a passion. She's great. And then at the state level, we have a gal who's new, who's taken on membership. And so through that, I've talked to a lot of people and kind of help guide them or train them to do the work they're doing, or tried to anyway.
And you were saying something earlier, and I think that just it flows well into my next question, is like, how have your own passions impacted your work with the league?
I think my passion for fairness and justice, it just breaks my heart to see people who for years and years and years have not been able to vote because of a mistake they made when they were a teenager, often with drugs or alcohol. I mean, things that are so common for so many people. And yet some people get caught and end up paying for a lifetime. That's just an injustice that has to be corrected. So I think it's that sense of the need for justice and, the importance of the democracy and participating. If you want the democracy to last and to serve us well, we have to work at it. And I get so frustrated with the political shenanigans and the rivalries, and frequently lately it's been worse than usual. I mean, I watch the rivalries, but back when I was watching the legislature in the 90s and the early 2000s, I'd see legislators Republican and Democrat walking out the door together, chatting about family, and that just doesn't happen as much anymore. The rivalries are, those guys are the bad guys, and they badmouth them all the time. And when there's a good give and take between two different political philosophies, you often come to much better public decisions. And that's just not happening now. And that's really pretty sad.
Are you able to identify part of the league's work that you think are the most important?
I think our voter registration and I think our candidate forums and Vote for One are probably really important. I wish that I could feel confident that more people were taking advantage of them. Over the years, more and more people have been watching. And with YouTube now, we can see how many people are watching. So I think that's important. I think our policy work, in particular, redistricting this session, I think was really important. We made people aware ahead of time how important it was. We actually were able to get some members of the House agreeing to a listening tour. 3 members of the House, 2 directly told us and 1 kind of hinted at it, that they were going to do a listening tour last fall to hear what the public thought about redrawing the boundaries. And the leadership nixed it. They wouldn't let that happen. So at least we convinced some members of the House that that was a good idea. And then we drew our own maps, and they did, both parties or both leadership groups in the House and Senate looked at our maps and say that they drew some of the lines based on what we had recommended. So I think that work was really important. And then again, I'll go back to the candidate forums. We have done a number of very public candidate forums in Louisville and Lexington around mayor's races. We've done gubernatorial candidate forums with TV stations across the state that were, I think, very helpful in providing good information to the public about those candidates. So those public events, and the fact that the media appreciates the work we've done and the way in which we go about it. They like our policies, and they agree to abide by our nonpartisan policies. I think that's really important work.
And are you able to say how influential you think the league has been in Lexington, the local league, and then how influential has the state league been in Kentucky in general?
I wish I could say that we were just, down in there and everybody paid attention and, agreed with us and listened to our policies. It's really hard to say. In Lexington, we have not been quite as involved as we could be, and I think that's going to change. One of the things that the league does across the country that is very valuable is observer corps work, where members of the league very visibly with their league buttons on go to public meetings, school board meetings, council meetings, planning committee meetings, health board of health meetings, library meetings. They listen and they take notes and they ask questions. That has been an important role of the league over the years, but we have not been successful at doing that locally. We thought we had a chair, and we thought we had had that going, and it didn't pan out. But we have a member now who's interested in taking that on, and I think she'll really get us going at that. And that's going to be important to say, here's an organization that is nonpartisan, that cares about good government, that is paying attention to what we're doing. Therefore, we need to pay attention to what we're doing and be accountable to the public. At the state level, before COVID, My colleague in legislative work and I would go over once a week and sit in on state government meetings and other hearings that we thought were important with our league pins on, and we would talk to legislators. Sometimes we would testify, but mostly we just listen, ask questions after the fact. Um, and I think that's important, but there are so many groups now that are doing that. We have joined forces with the Voting Rights Coalition, a group of, I'd say at least 20 or more, maybe 25 organizations that are also working to restore voting rights to persons with felony convictions. And that group as a whole, I think, is making a big difference. I don't think it's the league itself, but the thing that they count on is our reports. We do an update every couple of years, sometimes yearly, with the data on how many people are not able to vote because of that constitutional clause. And everybody uses our data, so we can provide that data, and we're seen as the go-to for that important information. So we're important. We contribute a lot, but I don't know how you would judge it on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't know. We might be a 3 or 4 at the state level. Although because our policies are pretty progressive, even though we're nonpartisan, a lot of people see us as being Democrats or liberal leaning. And so in some cases, they pay no attention to us. And as an example, down in Hopkinsville this year, the Republican candidates in their Republican caucus meeting in that community told everybody that they thought they should not participate in the league's candidate forums because they thought we were too liberal. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, that league has a solid reputation in the community. That directive, it was a letter, I think, was ended up being made public, and they backed off and changed their minds, and they did participate. So, that's a bit of a hindrance for us. And part of it is a lot of those policies were created 10, 15, 20 years ago. And they're very progressive policies. So we are seen often as being left-leaning. Mm-hmm. And that's to our detriment. We really have to work hard to maintain our nonpartisan status. And that nonpartisan doesn't mean not politically interested in issues. It means not supporting or opposing any particular candidate or party.
Mm-hmm. And what aspect of your work with the League are you most proud of?
I think the candidate forums. Mm-hmm. I mean, I worked on that probably for 15, 20 years, and I think we've got a good policies in place. We've built a good reputation, and I feel good about that.
Is there a finest moment that you can think of in your time with the League?
Well, when I thought they were going to do a listening tour around the redistricting issue, I felt pretty good. But I was not surprised when I learned leadership said no. So I was really proud. These are the little funny things, but a colleague and I from Louisville on the state board went to a national conference of state legislators event for legislators in Columbus, Ohio, 2.5 years ago. And when we walked in, there were 4 legislators from Kentucky sitting at a table, and the expressions on their faces when they saw us there and said, "What are you doing here?" was very heartwarming, in that they thought nobody cared, and they were going to be able to do this behind closed doors with total scrutiny, and with no scrutiny on the part of the public. And so when we started advocating and talking, we met with them, and you know, they, that was a good moment. It's like, hey, there's a public out there that cares about what you're doing. Pay attention.
Yeah.
So it's little things like that that are real heartwarming. And then to see other members step up and take roles that are really important. For example, Liza's taking on the candidate forums has been really heartwarming. So, and to watch Jen Jackson, I recruited her, invited her to be a part of the Lexington board a couple of years ago, and man, she's running with it now. She's just great. So those are really proud moments, proud things for me to think about.
What powerful things have you seen the League do that could not be accomplished by just an individual?
Could not be accomplished by
An individual.
an individual. Well, I think the candidate forums are one, the Vote for 1-1 is another. I wish I could say we had a role in a particular policy issue. If and when we get the constitutional amendment on the ballot and get it passed, that will, I think, be because of our diligence over the years. You know, when I worked with the Pritchard Committee, I mean, that was a real important part of my life and my education, because I never thought I'd be doing that kind of work. But the fact that the committee was responsible for, in a lot of ways, the Supreme Court ruling, because of the work we had done, the groundwork we had laid with the public, the committee can take responsibility. And I'm not taking responsibility. I'm saying the committee as a whole, under the leadership of our executive director, can take credit for making that happen and protecting it for a number of years from a lot of changes by the legislature. I think that nationally, there probably are some things we can take credit for. The National League used to be responsible for candidate forums for president. The Presidential Commission now does that, but Dot Writing sits on that committee that holds the national debates. So I think at the national level, the league can take credit for those kinds of things.
Where would you like to see the League in the future?
I think pretty much continuing. At the Lexington level, I really want to see that Observer Corps get active, because I think that sends a signal to the public that the league is there watching and paying attention and asking good questions, and that's a model for citizens to pay attention to. And it's a signal to the policy leaders that people who care and are not biased one way or another are watching and want to see good policy. So that's something I'd like to see at the local level. At the state level, I think I'd like to see our Vote for 1-1 expand so that more people are using it to get information about the candidates. I hope our candidate forums will continue. We've just lost the chair of that group at the state level, and so we're going to have to find somebody to take that on again. And I think at the state level, our ongoing work in 10 years, for example, I hope we have a better process for redistricting. And I hope within the next couple of years, people with a history of a felony conviction are automatically allowed to vote once they've completed their sentencing. That will be a huge win, and it's a huge goal for the league. And of course, we'd like to expand to more leagues across the state.
Well, that was my last official question, but I know you had come prepared with some things. Were you able to share all of those or
I
mention
think I
them?
was. I wanted to especially note that connection between the Pritchard Committee and their policies, and how the fact that they were so influential, I think, is largely based on the fact that they followed league principles.
Hmm.
You know, they were league members, deeply engaged in those early studies that decided what policies they would promote and follow. And so I think the league had a very important role to play in that work and education in the state. I wanted to be sure to make that point because I think that's critical. Yeah, I think we covered those things.
Anything else you'd like to add? Something that I didn't ask that you were wanting to share, or a gap that you think has been left out?
Not that comes to mind at the moment, but I'm sure as the day goes by, I'll think of it. But that's all right. We've covered plenty of territory. We can quit now.
I think, yeah, we got a good basis, but thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you for doing this. I am going to get back. And one of the things that I forgot to mention is the history of the Pritchard Committee. And these oral history interviews are fabulous. I'm delighted that these are happening. But one of the things that I've done over the years since I started with the committee is I have been keeping clippings anytime the league is mentioned in the media. And I've done that for Lexington, and I've done that at the state level since I've been on the state board. And that's kind of fun because it reminds us in visual format. I clip them, put them in plastic protective sheets, and then put them in 3-ring binders by year. And it's really fun to go back and see what the league has done over the years that has been made public. And as I've gone through some old archival materials that have been passed on to me, I found some old clippings from way back that are really interesting. The league's been public and in the public for quite a few years. Anyway, that's just another task that I took on that I'm now handing over to other people. So you can stop the recording.
Okay.
So